Imagine Chuck Norris walking down his quiet suburban street on a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind of street where neatly trimmed lawns meet perfectly aligned sidewalks under a canopy of mature maple trees turning gold in the early autumn light. This wasn't a movie set, there were no villains lurking in the shadows, just the mundane rhythm of everyday American life, sprinklers ticking, a distant lawnmower humming, the occasional car pulling out of a driveway. You clicked expecting perhaps another story of Norris intervening in a dramatic crime, maybe stopping a home invasion or confronting a reckless driver. The common belief is that neighborhood disputes, especially those involving homeowners associations, are petty squabbles best left to lawyers or ignored altogether, certainly not the arena for an international action star known for taking down global threats. People often see HOAs as annoying but ultimately necessary evils, enforcing rules about paint colors and lawn maintenance, dealing in minor infractions, not matters of fundamental human dignity or potentially illegal discrimination. But this situation wasn't about the approved shade of beige for exterior trim, or the acceptable height for hedges. This was about something far more profound, something that struck Norris with the force of a physical blow when he saw it. It was about his neighbor, Frank Miller, a good man recently confined to a wheelchair after a devastating accident, being systematically harassed, fined, and emotionally battered by their very own HOA board simply because the necessary wheelchair ramp leading to his front door, his lifeline to the outside world, was deemed aesthetically unpleasing by the board's self-appointed arbiters of taste. Therefore, Norris, witnessing this blatant lack of compassion, this bureaucratic cruelty masquerading as rule enforcement, felt a familiar fire ignite within him, not the explosive anger of his screen persona, but a cold, steady burn of righteous indignation. He knew he couldn't stand by while his neighbor was being punished for the simple act of needing safe access to his own home. This wasn't just about violating bylaws, it was about violating basic decency, potentially violating federal law, and Norris resolved right then and there to step directly into the fray, transforming this quiet suburban street into a battleground for fairness, accessibility, and respect. We're going to pull back the curtain on the shocking callousness of the HOA board, witness Frank Miller's quiet struggle against mounting fines and degrading demands, follow Norris as he meticulously gathers evidence and legal knowledge, and stand alongside him as he confronts the board directly, demanding they cease their discriminatory actions and uphold not just the neighborhood rules, but the fundamental rights of a resident in need, proving that protecting the vulnerable sometimes means taking on the tyranny hiding in plain sight, right next door. Frank Miller had lived in the Sycamore Creek Estates subdivision for nearly 20 years. He was a retired high school history teacher, a widower known for his meticulously kept garden, his quiet friendliness, and his encyclopedic knowledge of World War II aircraft, a passion he shared with Norris during occasional chats over the fence. Life had been predictable, comfortable, until 6 months prior when a freak ladder accident during routine gutter cleaning resulted in a severe spinal cord injury. The diagnosis was permanent paralysis from the waist down. Frank's world, once expansive and active, shrank overnight to the confines of his familiar split-level home, a home suddenly filled with insurmountable obstacles. Stairs he used to take 2 at a time became impassable barriers. Doorways seemed narrower, countertops higher, independence a distant memory. After weeks in the hospital and a grueling rehabilitation stint, Frank returned home determined to adapt, to maintain as much autonomy as possible. His daughter Laura, who lived across the state, helped him arrange for necessary modifications. They widened some interior doorways, installed grab bars in the bathroom, lowered kitchen counters. The most crucial modification, however, was exterior access. His front door had 3 steps leading up to it, making independent entry and exit impossible in his new wheelchair. The only practical solution was a wheelchair ramp. Working with a certified accessibility contractor recommended by the rehab center, Frank and Laura planned a simple, sturdy wooden ramp. It wasn't elaborate, following a straight path from the sidewalk alongside the existing steps to a small platform level with the front door. It was designed to be functional, safe, compliant with Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, guidelines regarding slope and railings, and built with pressure-treated lumber intended to weather naturally, blending reasonably well with the house's existing wood trim. Frank, being a rule-abiding resident for 2 decades, knew he needed HOA approval for any exterior modification. Therefore, before construction began, he dutifully submitted the contractor's detailed plans, blueprints, material lists, and even a letter explaining the medical necessity to the Sycamore Creek Estates Architectural Review Committee, ARC, a subcommittee of the main HOA board, anticipating a straightforward approval given the circumstances. He expected empathy, understanding, perhaps even an expedited process considering his situation. He could not have been more wrong. The initial response from the ARC, chaired by none other than the formidable HOA board president herself, Evelyn Henderson, arrived 2 weeks later. It wasn't an approval, but a curt denial letter. The letter, devoid of any expression of sympathy for Frank's situation, stated that the proposed wooden ramp design was not in harmony with the general aesthetic standards of the Sycamore Creek Estates community, and cited vague clauses in the CC and RS about maintaining visual conformity and preventing structures that could negatively impact neighboring property values. It suggested Frank explore alternative, less visually intrusive options, though it offered no specific examples or guidance. Frank was stunned, then deeply hurt. Not in harmony? He murmured to Laura over the phone, his voice trembling slightly. It's a ramp, Laura, not a monument. How else am I supposed to get in and out of my own house? Laura, furious on his behalf, immediately called Mrs. Henderson. The conversation was unproductive, even hostile. Mrs. Henderson, a woman known for her rigid adherence to rules, especially those she interpreted herself, and her pronouncements on neighborhood aesthetics delivered with unshakable certainty, was dismissive. She insisted the denial was based purely on the submitted plans violating aesthetic guidelines, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the neighborhood's pristine visual character. She brushed off Laura's mention of medical necessity, stating coldly that personal circumstances do not exempt residents from adhering to community standards. She suggested Frank consider installing a complex, extremely expensive mechanical lift system hidden inside his garage, a solution utterly impractical for Frank's budget and the layout of his house, requiring him to always enter and exit through the garage, weather permitting. Therefore, Frank and Laura felt trapped. They resubmitted the plans with minor cosmetic tweaks, offering to paint the wood a specific HOA-approved color, adding some lattice screening, hoping for a compromise. This revised submission was also denied, this time with an added warning that any unauthorized construction would result in immediate fines. Frank, needing desperately to regain some measure of freedom and attend ongoing physical therapy appointments without relying entirely on Laura making the long drive or expensive medical transport, felt he had no choice. His contractor assured him the ramp met all safety codes and ADA guidelines. Believing basic accessibility was a right that surely superseded subjective aesthetic concerns, Frank made the difficult decision to proceed with the construction, hoping the board would see reason once the ramp was installed and clearly necessary. The ramp was built quickly, efficiently over 2 days. It was simple, functional, and safe. For Frank, rolling up that ramp into his own home for the first time under his own power was a small but profound victory, a reclamation of dignity. But his relief was short-lived. The HOA's retribution was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours of the ramp's completion, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's management company. It contained a formal violation notice citing the unauthorized construction and imposing an initial fine of $100. More chillingly, it stated that fines would accrue at a rate of $50 per day until the ramp was removed or brought into compliance. Compliance the board had already refused to define in any achievable way beyond the impractical garage lift. Attached was a blurry photograph of the ramp, clearly taken from the street, highlighting its supposed intrusion into the neighborhood's visual landscape. Frank felt a wave of despair wash over him. This wasn't just about aesthetics anymore, it felt deeply personal, punitive. It felt like they were fining him simply for being disabled, for needing something that marked him as different. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. More letters arrived, each containing increasingly larger fines, the daily penalties accumulating rapidly. Mrs. Henderson reportedly made disparaging remarks about the unsightly ramp during informal chats with other neighbors, subtly poisoning the well of community opinion. Frank started receiving anonymous, typed notes in his mailbox telling him to remove the eyesore and respect the rules. He began feeling like a pariah in his own neighborhood, the stress exacerbating his already difficult physical recovery. He dreaded going outside, knowing neighbors might be judging him, whispering about the ramp, the fines, the trouble he was causing. He became withdrawn, depressed, the small victory of the ramp overshadowed by the constant harassment. Laura tried to intervene again, contacting the HOA's lawyer, attempting to explain the legal implications of the Fair Housing Act's requirements for reasonable accommodation for disabilities. The lawyer responded with legalese, essentially arguing that while the HOA acknowledged accessibility laws, Frank had failed to follow the proper procedural channels by building without final ARC approval, and that the HOA's aesthetic standards were reasonable and non-discriminatory, placing the onus entirely back on Frank. They were hiding behind procedure to justify their inflexible stance. Therefore, Frank felt utterly defeated. The fines were now approaching several $1,000s, a significant burden on his fixed retirement income. The emotional toll was immeasurable. He considered dismantling the ramp, resigning himself to being trapped, just to make the harassment stop. It was during this low point, as Frank sat slumped in his wheelchair staring at the latest threatening letter from the HOA, the crisp white envelope feeling heavier than lead, that Chuck Norris happened to walk by. Norris had been aware of Frank's accident and had offered quiet words of support shortly after his return from rehab. He hadn't known the details of the modifications or the subsequent conflict with the HOA. But that morning, as he walked past Frank's house, he noticed two things that immediately concerned him. First was the ramp itself, simple, functional, clearly necessary. Second was the official-looking notice taped conspicuously to Frank's front door, placed deliberately next to the ramp's handrail, almost like a scarlet letter. It was another violation notice from the HOA. Norris paused, his brow furrowing. He looked from the notice to the ramp, then towards Frank's living room window, where he could just make out Frank's silhouette sitting near the window, looking defeated. Norris felt an immediate, visceral sense of wrongness. He knew Frank, knew his character. He also knew the reputation of Evelyn Henderson and her rigid control over the HOA board. Putting the pieces together wasn't difficult. He walked up Frank's driveway, his expression shifting from concern to quiet determination. He knocked gently on the front door frame near the ramp. Frank startled, then slowly maneuvered his chair to the door, his face etched with weariness and apprehension. "Chuck," he said, surprise momentarily overriding his despair. "Didn't expect to see you." Norris nodded towards the notice still taped to the door. "Frank, what's this? Is the HOA giving you trouble about the ramp?" Frank sighed heavily, the story tumbling out, the denials, the fines, the suggestions for impractical lifts, the lawyer's stonewalling, the anonymous notes, the feeling of being targeted simply for needing help. He spoke with a quiet dignity, but the underlying pain and frustration were palpable. Norris listened intently, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as Frank recounted Mrs. Henderson's dismissive comments and the board's callous intransigence. He saw the ramp not as an eyesore, but as a symbol of Frank's resilience, his fight for independence. He saw the HOA's actions not as rule enforcement, but as blatant discrimination, a failure of basic human decency compounded by willful ignorance of the law. Therefore, when Frank finished speaking, his voice thick with emotion, Norris placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. "Frank," he said, his voice low but carrying unmistakable conviction, "this isn't right. It's not just wrong, it's likely illegal. You need this ramp. You have a right to access your home safely. They can't fine you into submission for being disabled. We're going to fight this." Frank looked up, a flicker of hope rekindling in his eyes for the first time in weeks. "We?" Norris smiled faintly. "Absolutely. You're not alone in this anymore. Let me look into a few things. Don't pay those fines. Don't let them intimidate you. We'll handle Mrs. Henderson and her committee. Norris wasn't one to charge into battle unprepared, even against an HOA board. He understood that winning this fight required more than just righteous anger, it required facts, legal understanding, and strategy. Therefore, the first thing he did was research. He spent hours that afternoon and evening online, delving into the specifics of the Federal Fair Housing Act, FHA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as they pertain to housing modifications. He learned about the requirement for housing providers, including HOAs, to make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, practices, or services, when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person with a disability equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. He read legal precedents clarifying that denying a medically necessary modification like a wheelchair ramp based solely on aesthetic concerns, especially when no feasible alternative exists, could constitute discrimination under the FHA. He printed out relevant sections of the laws, case summaries, and guidance documents from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. Next, he revisited the Sycamore Creek Estates CC and RS and bylaws himself, obtaining a copy from Frank. He scrutinized the sections on architectural standards, modification request procedures, and the board's authority. While the language regarding aesthetics was indeed broad, he noted it was also subjective and, crucially, subordinate to federal and state anti-discrimination laws. The bylaws contain no specific prohibitions against ramps, only the vague requirement for harmony. He also found the clause the board likely violated by making the initial denial decision without providing Frank a chance to discuss alternatives or appeal directly to the full board first, potentially violating their own procedural fairness rules. Armed with legal context and a better understanding of the HOA's own governing documents, Norris then reached out discreetly to a trusted contact, a lawyer specializing in real estate and disability law in nearby Austin. He explained the situation without initially revealing his personal involvement, seeking expert opinion on the strength of Frank's case. The lawyer confirmed Norris's assessment. The HOA's position was legally tenuous, likely discriminatory, and highly vulnerable to a legal challenge under the FHA. The lawyer emphasized the concept of reasonable accommodation, and how the HOA's refusal to engage meaningfully with Frank or offer viable alternatives severely weakened their stance. Therefore, Norris now had legal validation reinforcing his gut instinct. He knew the HOA was not just being cruel, they were breaking the law. The next step was confronting the board directly, but strategically. Norris knew simply showing up and making demands might be satisfying but potentially less effective than presenting a clear, undeniable case. He decided the upcoming monthly HOA board meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday evening, would be the perfect venue. He informed Frank of his plan, advising him to attend as well, not necessarily to speak, but to be present, a visible reminder of the human cost of the board's actions. Norris also spent some time talking quietly with a few other neighbors he knew to be reasonable and fair-minded, explaining Frank's situation and the board's intransigence. He wasn't asking them to picket or protest, just to be aware, to perhaps attend the meeting and lend silent support. He wanted the board to understand this wasn't just Frank's issue, it was becoming a community concern about fairness and decency. Thursday evening arrived. The community clubhouse meeting room, usually sparsely attended, was noticeably fuller than usual. Frank sat quietly in his wheelchair near the front, Laura beside him having driven in for support. Several of the neighbors Norris had spoken to were scattered through the audience. Norris himself took a seat near the back, waiting for the appropriate moment. The meeting progressed through the usual tedious agenda items: treasurer's report, landscaping updates, discussion of upcoming social events. Finally, the agenda reached new business and the open forum section where residents could address the board, typically limited to 3 minutes each. When the floor opened, Chuck Norris stood up calmly and walked towards the front table where President Evelyn Henderson sat, flanked by the other 4 board members. A ripple of surprise went through the room. While Norris was a resident, he rarely attended meetings and never spoke. Mrs. Henderson looked momentarily flustered but quickly regained her composed, slightly imperious demeanor. "Mr. Norris," she said, her voice tight. Do you wish to address the board? Norris nodded politely but firmly. Yes, Mrs. Henderson, I do. I'm here tonight to talk about Frank Miller and the unacceptable way this board, under your leadership, has treated him. He spoke calmly, his voice filling the room without being raised, commanding instant attention. He laid out the facts clearly, concisely: Frank's injury, the medical necessity of the ramp, the submission of plans, the denials based on vague aesthetic grounds, the punitive and escalating fines, the refusal to engage in meaningful discussion about reasonable alternatives. He held up copies of the denial letters, the violation notices. This isn't about maintaining community standards, Norris stated, his gaze sweeping across the board members, lingering for a moment on Mrs. Henderson. This is about discrimination. It's about a fundamental lack of compassion and a disturbing disregard for the law. He then proceeded to cite the specific provisions of the Fair Housing Act requiring reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. He explained that denying a necessary modification like Frank's ramp, solely on subjective aesthetic grounds, is a violation of federal law. He referenced HUD guidelines clarifying that HOAs cannot use aesthetic standards to prevent needed accessibility modifications. You suggested Frank install an expensive garage lift, Norris continued, his voice hardening slightly. Was that a reasonable suggestion? Did you consider the cost? The practicality? Or was it simply a way to avoid accommodating his actual needs because his ramp doesn't fit your personal definition of beauty? He paused, letting the questions hang in the air. And the fines, he went on, accumulating daily, causing immense stress and financial hardship. Are you fining Frank for needing a ramp? Are you fining him for being disabled? Mrs. Henderson started to interrupt, sputtering about procedures and architectural guidelines, but Norris held up a hand, gently but firmly halting her. The procedure you forced Frank into violating was flawed from the start because your initial denial was likely unlawful. Furthermore, your own bylaws require a process for appeal and discussion, which you denied him. He then addressed the entire board. This board has a legal and ethical obligation to accommodate Frank Miller's disability. His ramp is a medical necessity, built to code, and required for him to live safely and with dignity in his own home. Your personal aesthetic preferences do not supersede his rights under federal law. He placed a neatly compiled folder on the table in front of Mrs. Henderson. This folder contains copies of the relevant sections of the Fair Housing Act, HUD guidelines, summaries of legal precedents involving HOA discrimination against disabled residents, and copies of all correspondence between Frank and this board. I strongly suggest you review it carefully, perhaps with independent legal counsel not already invested in defending your current position. He then looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. I expect this board to immediately rescind all fines levied against Frank Miller related to the ramp. I expect you to formally approve the existing ramp as a reasonable accommodation under the FHA. And I expect a formal, written apology to Mr. Miller for the distress and harassment he has endured. His tone was calm, measured, but the underlying message was unmistakable. He wasn't asking, he was stating the necessary resolution. The room was silent. The board members looked stunned, exchanging uneasy glances. Mrs. Henderson's face was flushed, her usual composure shattered. She seemed to grasp, perhaps for the first time, the seriousness of the situation, the potential legal jeopardy she had placed the HOA in. The presence of Chuck Norris, known for his integrity and his quiet determination, combined with the clear recitation of the law and the folder of evidence sitting ominously on the table, created an undeniable pressure. Several residents in the audience murmured supportively. One neighbor Norris had spoken to stood up briefly. Mr. Norris is right, she said clearly. What's happened to Frank is wrong. This board needs to fix this. Other heads nodded in agreement. The united front, the legal clarity, and the sheer force of Norris's reasoned, unwavering stance left the board cornered. Mrs. Henderson, visibly deflated, conferred briefly in whispers with the board member sitting next to her, who also served as the HOA's treasurer and was known to be more pragmatic. After a tense minute, she cleared her throat. Mr. Norris, she began, her voice lacking its usual authority. The board takes accusations of discrimination very seriously. We will review the information you have provided and reconsider Mr. Miller's situation immediately. Norris held her gaze. Reconsideration isn't sufficient, Mrs. Henderson. Compliance with the law is required. Rescind the fines. Approve the ramp. Apologize to Frank. That is the only acceptable outcome. He didn't wait for further hedging. He simply nodded towards Frank, then turned and walked calmly back to his seat, his point made, the expectation set. The rest of the meeting dissolved quickly, the board clearly needing to regroup and consult legal counsel, likely different counsel this time. The next morning, Frank Miller received a hand-delivered letter. It was from the HOA board. It formally rescinded all fines related to the ramp. It stated that, upon review and consideration of information related to the Fair Housing Act, the board acknowledged the ramp as a necessary and reasonable accommodation and granted retroactive approval. Enclosed was a separate, brief letter signed by all 5 board members, including Evelyn Henderson, offering a formal apology to Mr. Miller for the misunderstanding and any distress caused during the architectural review process. It wasn't the most heartfelt apology, steeped slightly in face-saving language, but it was an apology nonetheless, and crucially, it met the demands Norris had laid out. Frank felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. He looked out his window at his simple wooden ramp, no longer a source of anxiety and shame, but a symbol of his hard-won independence and the power of a neighbor who refused to stand by in the face of injustice. Chuck Norris, walking his dog later that day, saw Frank sitting on his porch, enjoying the autumn sunshine, accessing his own home freely, safely, and without harassment. Norris simply gave him a quiet nod and a small smile. Justice, even on a quiet suburban street, had been served. The battle was over. Frank could finally focus on healing, knowing his right to live with dignity in his own home was secure, thanks to a neighbor who believed in fighting for what was right, no matter the opponent. If you love this story, make sure you subscribe to our channel and watch much more stories like this every day.